The courtroom was so silent, you could hear the hum of the overhead lights, the faint buzz of a fly trapped near the window. Every breath felt heavy, every movement calculated. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as all eyes locked onto the small boy standing at the witness stand. Ethan Parker, just 11 years old, his knuckles white from gripping the wooden rail in front of him. His chest rose and fell in quick, uneven breaths, but his gaze, wide, frightened, determined, never wavered. Across the room, Emily Parker sat at the defense table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her face streaked with silent tears. But she wasn't crying because she was afraid. She wasn't crying because of the weight of the accusations against her. She was crying because she knew what her little brother was about to say would change everything. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry as sandpaper. He stole a glance at his mother, Julie Parker, whose hands trembled where they rested in her lap. She didn't speak, but the silent plea in her eyes was unmistakable. Think before you speak. Next to her sat Robert Parker, his towering frame rigid, his expression a mask of cold indifference. He hadn't looked at Ethan once since he walked up to the stand. The judge leaned forward slightly, voice calm but expectant. "Ethan, please tell us what you saw." Ethan's fingers curled against the rail. His heart pounded so loudly he was sure they could all hear it. But he had to do this. He had no choice. He took a shaky breath. "I saw what happened." His voice was small, but the weight behind it made the entire courtroom lean in. It wasn't Emily. It was... A pause. A hesitation. His lips trembled. Then, with a kind of courage no one expected from a boy his age, he finished. "It was Dad." The silence that followed wasn't really silence at all. It was the kind that felt deafening, like a bomb had just been dropped, and no one knew how to react. A collective gasp rippled through the room. A pen clattered to the floor from the prosecutor's hand. Emily's own hands flew to her mouth, a choked sob escaping before she could stop it. Even her lawyer, who had been fighting tooth and nail to prove her innocence, looked momentarily stunned. Robert Parker didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just sat there, jaw clenched so tight a muscle in his cheek twitched. The judge's voice sliced through the stunned air. "Order in the court." The murmurs died down, but the tension remained, thick and suffocating. Ethan's shoulders slumped as he finally let out the breath he had been holding. He had done it. He had told the truth. But as the weight of what he had just said settled over him, he realized something. This wasn't over. Not even close. 2 months earlier, the Parker household had been just like any other. Or at least, that's how it looked from the outside. Ethan and Emily had always been close. She was more than just his older sister. She was his protector, his hero. When bullies shoved him in the hallway at school, it was Emily who marched over and made them back off. When he struggled with math, she was the one who sat beside him for hours, breaking things down in a way only she could. Even when their parents fought, when their father's voice would rise just a little too loud, when their mother's responses grew sharp and defensive, Emily made sure Ethan never felt alone. "Come on, E," she'd say, nudging him toward the door before things got worse. "Let's go for a walk." And they'd go. Because when their father's temper flared, the best thing to do was leave. Robert Parker was a man whose presence filled a room before he even spoke. Tall, broad-shouldered, a booming voice that could command attention with a single word. He was a businessman, always dressed in sharp suits, always working long hours. But when he was home, the atmosphere shifted, like a storm cloud settling over the house, ready to break at any moment. Some nights he was fine, quiet, distant, but other nights he'd slam the front door so hard the walls rattled. He'd demand to know why dinner wasn't ready or why Ethan had left his backpack by the stairs. He never hit them. No, he never crossed that line. But his anger could cut just as deep. And once he started, it was like he couldn't stop. Julie would try to calm him down, to reason with him, but sometimes even she couldn't predict what would set him off. Ethan had learned to stay out of his way. Emily, though. Emily wasn't like that. She stood her ground, pushed back when she felt she had to, and Robert hated that. Then came the night everything changed. It started as any other evening. Emily had stayed late after school to tutor a classmate, so Ethan was alone when Robert came home. The door slammed hard enough to make him flinch from where he sat at the kitchen table. He didn't move, didn't even breathe as heavy footsteps stormed through the house. "Where's your sister?" Robert barked, his voice thick with irritation. Ethan straightened his back. "She's tutoring, Dad." Robert muttered something under his breath, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and sank into his recliner. Ethan didn't wait around to see what kind of mood he was in. He slipped upstairs, closing his door softly behind him. When Emily finally got home that night, she looked pale, shaken. She didn't say much, barely touched her dinner, barely looked up when Ethan tried to show her something funny on his phone. He wanted to ask what was wrong, but something about the way she stared at the table, like she wasn't really there, made him hesitate. The next morning, the police were at their door. Ethan was halfway down the stairs when he saw them. 2 officers, standing stiffly in the living room, their hands resting on their belts. His mother's voice was calm but tight, her hands clenching and unclenching at her sides. "What is this about?" she asked. One of the officers looked at Emily. "Emily Parker, we need you to come with us." Ethan's stomach twisted. "What?" He looked at his sister, expecting her to say something, to fight back, to do something, but she just stood there, her face frozen, her hands shaking at her sides. Julie stepped forward. "Hold on. You can't just—" "There's been an incident," the officer continued. "Your daughter has been named as a suspect." Ethan felt his breath leave his body. "That's not possible," he blurted out. "She didn't do anything." But the officers weren't listening. They were already pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Emily turned, her eyes finally locking onto Ethan's, and that's when he saw it. Not fear, not anger, but something worse. Resignation. "Mom," she whispered, voice cracking. "Call Hartman." Then the cuffs clicked shut around her wrists. Ethan felt his body move before he could think. "Wait! She didn't do anything!" He tried to push forward, but his mother held him back, her grip firm on his arm. "Ethan, stop," she murmured, voice thick with something unreadable. Ethan could only watch as the officers led Emily out the front door. The next few days were a blur of confusion, whispered phone calls, and hushed conversations that stopped the second Ethan walked into a room. He didn't understand. None of it made sense. His sister was the kindest person he knew. She helped people, protected people. She wouldn't hurt anyone. But the evidence kept piling up. Witnesses claimed they saw her near the scene of the crime. Her fingerprints were found on a key piece of evidence. And worst of all, the victim, Mr. Klein, their neighbor, had argued with Emily before. Ethan sat on the stairs, listening to his parents argue behind closed doors. "She's being framed," Julie insisted. Robert scoffed. "By who?" "There's no conspiracy here, Julie. The cops have evidence. She's our daughter. And that means what? That she's innocent by default?" A beat of silence. Then Julie's voice, softer this time. "You don't even seem surprised." Robert didn't answer. Ethan gripped the railing so tight his knuckles turned white. This wasn't right. None of it was right. Emily wasn't guilty. But if she wasn't, then someone had gone through a lot of trouble to make it look like she was, and Ethan was going to find out who. The house was different now, quieter, colder, like something vital had been ripped away when Emily walked out in handcuffs. Ethan noticed everything. How his mom hardly ate, how she stared out the window for long stretches of time, how she whispered on the phone with Emily's lawyer late into the night. But it was his dad who unsettled him the most. Robert Parker wasn't the type to panic. He wasn't the type to worry. And that's what scared Ethan. Because while his mother's grief and desperation were written all over her face, his father barely reacted at all. One night, long after Ethan had been sent to bed, he heard them, his parents, arguing. It started as muffled voices behind their bedroom door, too low to make out. But then his mother's voice cut through the quiet, sharp, angry, edged with something Ethan couldn't quite place. "You can't just make this go away, Robert." Ethan froze. Robert's response was quieter. Too quiet. "You think I'd let our daughter go to prison?" His voice was controlled, measured. "It's handled." Ethan's stomach twisted. "Handled?" Julie's voice wavered. "What do you mean?" A pause. The bed springs creaked as someone, his father, shifted their weight. Then a low murmur. "You don't want to know." Ethan's heart pounded so loudly, he thought they might hear it from behind the door. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay still, to listen. Julie exhaled sharply. "I swear to God, if you had anything to do with this—" Robert cut her off. "I did what I had to do." The silence that followed was heavier than words could ever be. Ethan didn't wait to hear more. He turned, his feet moving before he could process what he was doing, and rushed back to his room. He barely made it to his bed before his legs gave out beneath him. His father's words echoed in his skull. "It's handled." Sleep didn't come that night. Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing. He tried to convince himself that he had misheard, that it didn't mean what it sounded like. But deep down, he already knew. Emily was innocent, and his father wasn't. The thought made his stomach churn. He didn't want it to be true. He didn't want to believe that his own father could do something so monstrous. But the way Robert had spoken, the way he dismissed Julie's concern like it was a minor inconvenience, Ethan had to know the truth. He had to be sure. So the next afternoon, when his parents left for a meeting with Emily's lawyer, Ethan slipped downstairs. The house was eerily silent as he crept toward his father's study, his heart hammering in his chest. Robert always kept his study locked, but not today. Ethan hesitated for only a second before twisting the doorknob and slipping inside. The air was thick with the smell of leather and paper, and the heavy oak desk stood like an immovable fortress in the center of the room. Papers were stacked in neat piles, some in folders, some loose. His dad's laptop sat closed at the edge of the desk, but Ethan didn't dare touch it. Instead, he focused on the papers. He rifled through the stacks, fingers trembling as he scanned page after page. Then, he saw it. A crumpled note shoved between two folders. Ethan smoothed it out with unsteady hands. His breath caught as he read the words scribbled in his father's sharp, hurried handwriting. "Klein is a problem that needs solving. Emily is the perfect distraction. Ensure all trails lead back to her." Ethan nearly dropped the paper. His vision blurred as the words repeated in his head. His dad had planned this. He framed Emily. His legs felt weak. His fingers trembled. He wanted to believe it was a mistake, that maybe he was misunderstanding. But then he saw the second note. Dates, times, the night of the attack. His father's schedule lined up perfectly. It wasn't a mistake. His father was guilty. Ethan sucked in a sharp breath and backed away from the desk, the paper still clenched in his hands. His stomach twisted violently. He thought he might be sick. What was he supposed to do? If he told the truth, if he took these notes to someone, his dad would go to jail. But if he didn't, Emily would. Ethan thought about how she used to walk him home from school every day, how she'd stand in front of him when their dad was in one of his moods, taking the brunt of it so Ethan wouldn't have to, how she never backed down, no matter how scared she was. Now, it was Ethan's turn. He exhaled shakily and clenched his jaw. He knew what he had to do. The night before the testimony, Ethan sat alone in his room, the crumpled papers still in his hands. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think about anything else. His father had done this, to Emily, to their family, and tomorrow Ethan would have to stand up in front of an entire courtroom and say it out loud. He squeezed his eyes shut and thought about Emily. She had always protected him. Now, he would protect her, no matter what. The courtroom was silent as Ethan took the stand. His hand shook as he sat down, but he forced himself to keep his back straight. His father sat across the room, staring at him, his face unreadable. His mother, pale and tense, clasped her hands in her lap. Emily, her eyes wide, sat at the defense table, her breath held tight in her chest. The judge spoke. "Ethan Parker, please state what you saw." Ethan swallowed hard. He could feel his dad's eyes burning into him. He could feel his entire body screaming at him to shut up, to stay quiet, to keep the peace. But then he saw Emily. Saw the way she was looking at him, like she was still trying to protect him, even now. Ethan gritted his teeth, steadied his hands, and spoke. "I saw what happened," he said, voice shaking. "It wasn't Emily." A pause. His father's stare sharpened. Ethan clenched his fists. "It was Dad." The courtroom exploded. Gasps, murmurs. Someone whispered, "Oh my God." The prosecutor's pen clattered to the table. Emily's lawyer jumped to her feet. His mother let out a broken, strangled sound. But Robert? Robert didn't move, didn't flinch. His father just stared. The judge slammed her gavel down. "Order in the court." But Ethan didn't look away. He had done it. He had told the truth. And whatever happened next, there was no going back. The house was different now. Not just quiet, but hollow. As if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of Ethan's words in the courtroom. Robert had been released on bail. Ethan didn't understand how, didn't know how it was even possible. But there he was, standing in their living room like nothing had happened. Dinner was unbearable. The clinking of forks against plates was the only sound. Julie kept her eyes down, her fingers trembling slightly as she pushed food around on her plate. Ethan couldn't even eat. He could feel his father stare on him, sharp and cutting. Finally, Robert spoke. "You're going to fix this." Ethan's stomach twisted. He set his fork down, barely managing to meet his father's eyes. "Fix what?" His voice was small. Robert leaned forward, his jaw clenched. "You know exactly what." Julie's hand shot out, grabbing Ethan's. "Robert, stop." "Stop?" Robert let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "He stood up in front of that courtroom and lied about me." His voice hardened. "He's going to tell them he made a mistake." Ethan's heart pounded. "I didn't lie." Robert slammed his fist against the table. The sound made Julie flinch. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" His voice was low, dangerous. "You think those people care about the truth? You think they care about us?" He pointed a finger at Ethan. "You're going to go back in there and tell them you were confused, that the pressure got to you." His eyes burned into Ethan's. "Because if you don't, you're going to tear this family apart." Ethan's hands balled into fists in his lap. "Dad," he said, voice steadier than he expected, "you already did that." Robert's face darkened. He pushed back from the table so hard the chair scraped against the floor. Julie moved quickly, stepping between them. "That's enough." Robert stared at Ethan for a long moment. Then, with a scoff, he turned and stormed out of the kitchen. A moment later, the front door slammed shut. Julie exhaled shakily and turned to Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. "Go to your room." Ethan hesitated. "Mom, Go." He didn't argue. But as he climbed the stairs, he knew one thing for certain. His father wasn't done. Not yet. Late that night, long after the house had gone still, a soft knock came at Ethan's door. He sat up instantly, his heart pounding, until he heard Emily's whisper, "Let me in." He scrambled out of bed and opened the door just enough for her to slip inside. She looked exhausted, her eyes shadowed with worry. We need proof, she whispered. Ethan swallowed. I already gave them my testimony. That's not enough. Emily's voice was urgent. Dad's got money, power. He can twist things, make them go away. We need something solid. Ethan thought about the notes he had found in Robert's study. It had been enough to make him testify, but would it be enough to convict his father? Come on, Emily said. We don't have much time. They moved in silence, creeping down the hall. Their parents' bedroom door was closed, but Ethan wasn't sure if Robert was even home. That thought alone sent a cold shiver down his spine. The study door was locked this time. Of course, Emily muttered. Ethan hesitated, then pulled a paperclip from his pocket. Emily blinked at him. You know how to pick locks? I watched a video once. Ethan, do you want in or not? Emily huffed. Fine, hurry up. Ethan's hands shook as he worked the lock, but after a few tense seconds, there was a quiet click. The door creaked open, and they slipped inside. They moved fast. Emily rifled through drawers while Ethan scanned the desk. Then he saw it, a folded piece of paper shoved under a pile of invoices. He pulled it out, his breath catching as he read the words written in his father's familiar handwriting. Cleanup plan, cabin. He turned to Emily, his hands cold. The cabin. Emily paled. Number no way. The Parker family owned a remote cabin deep in the woods, far from the nearest town. No neighbors, no cell service. It was the perfect place to make someone disappear. Emily snatched the paper from him, scanning the details. Ethan. She looked at him, voice shaking. I don't think he just planned on covering up the crime. I think he's planning on getting rid of us. Ethan's stomach twisted violently. We have to go. Now. They barely made it to the front door before the sound of an engine roaring to life outside made them freeze. Emily grabbed Ethan's arm, eyes wide. That's Dad's truck. The headlights flooded through the windows, casting long shadows against the walls. He's home. The front door handle rattled. Ethan and Emily barely had a second to react before Robert's voice cut through the silence. Where do you think you're going? Emily pulled Ethan back, her grip tight. Robert stepped inside, his face unreadable, his eyes dark with something dangerous. The front door clicked shut behind him. I'll give you one chance to sit back down, he said, his voice calm. Too calm. Ethan glanced at Emily. The fear in her eyes was real. Then, without thinking, he grabbed her hand. Run! They bolted toward the back door. Robert's voice roared behind them. Stop! They didn't. They burst out into the backyard, the cold night air slamming against their skin. The woods loomed ahead. They ran. Branches clawed at their arms, their legs. The uneven ground threatened to trip them with every step. Behind them, the sound of Robert's footsteps was getting closer. Then, bang! The sound of a gunshot shattered the night. Ethan's blood ran cold. Emily yanked him down behind a fallen tree, her breath ragged. He has a gun, Ethan whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. Emily's grip tightened around his wrist. We can't stop. Robert's voice called out, closer this time. You can't outrun me. Emily's eyes flickered toward a path leading deeper into the forest. This way, she whispered. They ran again, faster this time, fueled by pure adrenaline. The trees closed in around them, the world narrowing to just their pounding footsteps, and the sound of their father crashing through the underbrush behind them. Then, Ethan saw it, a clearing up ahead, lights, flashing blue and red. His heart leapt. The police. Robert saw it too, and for the first time he hesitated. Ethan turned back, gasping for breath, watching as his father took one step forward, then another, before stopping completely. His face was unreadable in the dim moonlight. Then, without a word, Robert lowered the gun and stepped back into the shadows. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder. Ethan didn't move, couldn't breathe. Emily grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. "It's over," she whispered. But Ethan knew better. Not yet. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness, slicing through the towering trees like a lifeline. The wail of sirens filled the air, growing louder, sharper, until they drowned out everything else. The pounding of Ethan's heart, the crunch of Robert's boots against the dirt, the weight of fear that had been pressing down on his chest for what felt like forever. Robert stood at the edge of the clearing, his gun still clenched in his hand. He didn't move, didn't run. He just stood there, frozen, his face unreadable as the squad cars skidded to a stop, kicking up gravel and dead leaves. Then, voices, commands being shouted, the crackling of police radios. "Drop the weapon!" Robert hesitated for only a second. Then, slowly, he let the gun slip from his fingers. It hit the ground with a dull thud. Officers rushed forward, surrounding him, moving with practiced precision. They forced him to his knees, his hands wrenched behind his back, cuffs clicking into place. Ethan barely breathed. His legs felt weak, his body swaying as the adrenaline started to wear off. Emily was the first to move. She grabbed Ethan's hand, holding on so tightly it almost hurt. "It's over," she whispered, her voice trembling. But Ethan wasn't sure if she was telling him or herself. As they watched their father being led to one of the waiting police cars, Ethan expected to feel something. Relief, victory, justice. But all he felt was hollow. He wasn't sure if that feeling would ever go away. The trial felt like déjà vu, the same courtroom, the same heavy silence. But this time, Ethan wasn't on the stand to accuse his father. He was here to end this. The prosecution laid everything out. The notes from Robert's study, the map labeled cleanup plan, the financial records tying him to the attack on Mr. Klein. The jury sat stiff and unblinking as each new piece of evidence was laid before them, the puzzle finally coming together. Robert sat at the defense table, his suit crisp, his expression unreadable. His lawyer tried to spin the story, tried to cast doubt, but it was useless. The truth was undeniable. Then Ethan was called to the stand. As he walked up, he could feel his father's eyes on him. But Ethan didn't falter. Not this time. He took a breath, met his lawyer's gaze, and spoke. He told them everything. From the first moment he suspected something was wrong, to sneaking into his father's study, to the night in the woods when Robert had chased them down with a gun. Every word left his lips like a weight being lifted. And when he was done, he looked directly at his father. Robert didn't say a word, didn't even blink. The final nail in the coffin came when Julie Parker took the stand. For years, she had stayed silent, had done everything to keep the peace, but not anymore. She told them what she heard that night, what Robert had admitted to. And when she finished, her voice calm and steady, she looked at him one last time. "I should have stopped you a long time ago." Robert's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. It didn't matter, because by the end of the week, the jury had reached their verdict. Guilty, on all counts. Ethan exhaled, and for the first time in months, he felt free. Emily's name was cleared, officially, legally. She walked out of the courthouse that day lighter, her shoulders no longer burdened by something she had never done. But the damage lingered. Ethan still woke up at night, heart pounding, expecting to hear his father's voice outside his door. Julie flinched at sudden noises like she was waiting for a fight to break out. Emily smiled, but it didn't always reach her eyes. Their house, once a home, now felt like a graveyard. So they decided to leave it behind. Julie found a small place a few miles away, a house that wasn't tainted by bad memories. It wasn't big, but it was warm, safe, a fresh start. Packing up was harder than Ethan expected. He found himself sitting in his empty room, staring at the blank walls, remembering the boy who had lived here. A boy who had once thought his father was invincible. That boy didn't exist anymore. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not. Months passed. The house settled into a new kind of quiet, one that wasn't filled with fear but with healing. Ethan focused on school, on rebuilding. Emily was preparing for college, excited about a future she had almost lost. Things were getting better. Then, one afternoon, a plain white envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Just his name scrawled on the front. Ethan hesitated before opening it. Inside was a letter. Ethan, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to try. I've been thinking about what you said in court. About what I did. And for whatever it's worth, I'm sorry. I know that word means nothing now. I know I can't undo what I did. But I need you to understand. Everything I did was to protect this family. I thought I was doing what was right. I thought I was in control. But I wasn't. You were. You had the strength to stand up and do what I couldn't. And for that, I hate you. But I'm also proud of you. You're a better man than I ever was. Take care of your mother. Take care of Emily. Don't be like me. Dad. Ethan read the letter 3 times, then a 4th. His hands trembled slightly, but not with anger. Emily walked into the kitchen, catching sight of the paper in his hands. Is that from him? Ethan nodded. Are you going to write back? He thought about it. Then slowly, he folded the letter and set it aside. Not today. Emily didn't push. She just squeezed his shoulder before grabbing a drink from the fridge. Good. You're still you. Ethan didn't know what he felt. He wasn't sure if he could ever forgive his father, but maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to. Maybe it was enough to move forward. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed he could. Ethan never thought of himself as brave. Brave was Emily, standing up to their father even when she knew it would cost her. Brave was his mother, facing the truth she had tried so hard to ignore. Brave was walking into that courtroom and saying the words that shattered his family, even though it had felt like breaking himself in the process. But maybe, he realized, bravery wasn't about being fearless. Maybe it was about speaking up even when your voice shook. Months had passed since the trial, but its echoes still lingered. Some nights, Ethan still woke up expecting to hear heavy footsteps in the hallway, his father's voice just outside his door. The past didn't just disappear overnight, but it no longer controlled him. In some ways, the hardest part wasn't standing in court or facing his father. It was learning how to live after it was all over. For a long time, he had felt powerless, trapped in his father's shadow. But now he was discovering something new. His voice. It started small, answering questions in class when before he would have kept his head down, speaking up when he saw something that didn't sit right. And then, one day, almost on a whim, he signed up for the debate team. Emily had teased him about it. You spent half your life avoiding conflict, and this is what you pick? But Ethan had smiled. I think I just got tired of being scared. His first debate was nerve-wracking. His hands trembled as he stood before the judges, his heart hammering against his ribs. But then, he spoke, and for the first time, he didn't feel small. He felt heard. As the weeks went on, his confidence grew. He wasn't just talking, he was fighting. Fighting with words, with logic, with reason. And every time he stood at that podium, it felt like reclaiming a piece of himself that he had once thought lost. His father had tried to silence him, had tried to make him believe that his words didn't matter. But they did. They had saved his sister. They had uncovered the truth. They had set him free. Emily was moving forward too. College applications, new beginnings, a future she had almost lost. Julie had found her own kind of strength, working, rebuilding, letting herself be more than just someone else's anchor. They weren't the same family they had been before. But maybe that was a good thing. Maybe, in some ways, they had been broken long before Ethan ever took that stand. Maybe the truth didn't break them. It freed them. One evening, Ethan sat outside on their new porch, watching the sun dip behind the horizon. Emily walked out, nudging his shoulder with her own. "Penny, for your thoughts?" He let out a small breath, turning to her. "I was just thinking—" He paused, the words settling in his chest. "The truth didn't just set you free, Em." She looked at him, curious. He smiled, eyes flickering back toward the setting sun. "It set me free too. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel, then don't stop here. There are more stories to tell, more voices that deserve to be heard. So hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Join us as we uncover more powerful stories, stories of truth, resilience, and the strength it takes to stand up when the world wants you to stay silent. Your support means everything. And remember, your voice matters too. Subscribe now and let's keep the conversation going.